I'm going to give you a brief overview of Greek civilization. Remember that we use civilization in quotation marks. Now, we mark time from what we deem to be the re-emergence of Greek people and communities as we know them later on. So, in many ways, what allowed the Greeks to re-emerge as a people aware of themselves is the intercultural contact between the Near East, where there were flourishing Assyrian and Persian empires, and Greece, where these people or civilization emerged after 1000 BCE, that is, before the Common Era. Geographically, this was made possible because of Greece's location, which enabled trade, travel, but also war that is centrally located on the Mediterranean. This allowed the Greeks to rediscover writing in 800 BCE. And by being confronted with cultural difference, it gave them a sense of cultural identity as Greeks. It also encouraged trade and industry and allowed the introduction of new technology, notably iron. So around 1000 BCE, the Greeks developed independent city-states that they called polis. A polis is an independent community of citizens not ruled by a king. So politically, the Greeks differed from the Egyptians and the Persians. This was not the hierarchical monarchy or empire that existed elsewhere. An independent city-state was neither centralized as a country or an empire, and it was organized according to a principle of equality and not hierarchy. So what made the polis unique is the sense of horizontality. It was a horizontal community rather than a vertical one, that is, top down. It was thought of as a community of relatives bound together by similar values, as you'll see in the primary document. All of its citizens were theoretically descended from a common ancestor and worshipped gods in common ceremonies. The philosopher Aristotle, in fact, argued that the polis was a natural growth and that humans being were, and I quote, by nature an animal who lives on the polis. That is, for Aristotle, the human is a social animal because humans alone have the power of speech and the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. That is, the capacity for morality and ethics. Which is why the Greeks believed that the most important values were those of law and justice as the foundations of political organization. This was very important. There was an ingrained notion of equal treatment under the law and in front of justice, irrespective of social status and wealth. And power was exercised through voting and through the gradual extension of right to hold office. For women, however, this was far less freedom and recognition and power that existed under the Egyptians. So city-states were not built around religious buildings like Mesopotamia, but in fact built around what was called the agora. That is the marketplace, which was the civic center which allowed all to congregate. This was the heart of social and political life. But this organization, political organization, was not available to all. It may be horizontal, premised upon equality, but in fact, it was structured through a series of exclusions. First of all, not everyone was free or considered free under the law. In fact, the Greeks had a large population of enslaved people. A third of its population was enslaved by the 5th centuries. And you could become enslaved through debt or through war, that is, military defeat. Second, there was a category of people called the metics, that is, foreigners granted permanent resident status in return for paying taxes and serving in the military. And of course, women were not considered free. Now, these three categories made up the majority of Athens' population by 400 BCE, but lacked political rights. So this complicates the notion of horizontality and radical equality for all. Now, these different city-states also developed into different political systems. Tyranny, which means rule by one, as was evidenced by Corinth from 657 to 585 BC. Oligarchy, ruled by a few, like Sparta, from 700 to 500 BC. And democracy, which means rule by many, in Athens from 632 to 500 BC. And this political system was tied to social values commonly shared by all city-states, such as arete, which means excellence. For instance, exemplified in the Olympic Games, which was an international religious festival created in 776 BCE to showcase the value of arete, and took place in a stadium. As your textbook writes, and I quote, although Olympics existed to glorify individual excellence by identifying winners and losers, the Games organizations reveal something important about Greek culture. Games were open to any socially elite free Greek man good enough to compete and any male spectator. Now notice, this was certainly not open to women. And in fact, women were second-class citizens in almost all matters, as was translated in sexual organization. And you will read and be able to identify some of these values in the poems that are provided for this week. Now, these principles, political, social, lead to what we call the Greek Golden Age, and one of its most distinctive legacies, an intellectual revolution. Now, this was a time dominated by wars, yet that allowed the development of new modes of thinking. For instance, philosophy, which means love of wisdom, history, literature in the form of tragedy and comedy, and what we might today refer to as science. Why do we call this an intellectual revolution? Because in fact, the development of these types of knowledges and how people thought about them relied on an important set of beliefs. First of all, the belief that empathy allowed one to understand the world and one another better. Namely, that rational behavior is based on the ability to perceive and comprehend both or all sides of the issue. For instance, think of the dramatic conflict of values that are portrayed on stage in a tragedy, the importance of role reversal in comedies, dialogues in Plato's philosophy, but also in sophist philosophy, where the sophists were trained to argue all sides and never settle just on one. Empathy could be used to civilize citizens, and through empathy, one comes to see both sides of the issues and become more capable of rational decision-making, the best and most rational decision. But this intellectual revolution occurred in a world steeped in religion, because the Greeks, like the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Persians before them, were also polytheists. And my next lecture will cover polytheism and the emergence of monotheism with the Hebrew.